The story of Exodus is the story of us. No matter how hard we try, we can't shake this longing to be free. But it's been so long, and we only know a life of bondage, of unanswered prayers and dreams that have died. Where will deliverance come from? What will it take?
All right, so we're starting a new series in the book of Exodus. I'm pumped. Does anyone in here know who wrote the book of Exodus? No. Anyone? Who wrote it, Messi? Moses. Good answer. You're right. Moses wrote the book of Exodus, and I want you guys to see this. It literally starts off, verse 1 says, "Now these are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt. Each man, each his household came with Jacob." It literally starts off like, now, blah, 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 blah. In some translations, it starts off with the word "and," because the book of Exodus is truly, all it is it's a continuation of Genesis. It's literally like if Genesis is Star Wars: A New Hope, this is Exodus would be Empire Strikes Back. If Genesis is the first Iron Man, Exodus is Iron Man 2. If Genesis is Frozen, Exodus is Frozen 2. It's a continuation of the same story. That makes sense, right? I'm not losing anyone here, right? So we're going to go into the unknown with this. Get it? Like Frozen 2. All right. So we've got the nation of Israel. And Israel, you're going to hear me refer to it a lot. That is literally the Jewish people. It's the Jewish race. It's the Jewish religion. They are the nation of Israel. And in the book of Genesis, they actually were called Joseph. Do you guys know the name Joseph? Have you guys heard the name? So there was a famine coming to the land, and he actually got his family and all the nation of Israel to eventually come to Egypt. And Egypt is very prosperous. The land of Canaan, where they were coming from, was in a famine. So a famine, you guys know what a famine is? It's when there's like no food, right? You're going to die because you don't have food to eat. So they all come and they find themselves in Egypt. And this is where the book of Exodus starts. And it starts to list these names. Each man, his household came with Jacob. Verse 2, Reuben. Are you here? No, Reuben's not here. Simeon, I feel like I'm taking attendance. Simeon, right? You guys have that one kid who says present, right? It's always just one. Here, yo, here, here, present, right? Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. Thank you. All right. Shh. All those who were descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. For Joseph, who we talked about, was in Egypt already. And we already know this happened. Joseph died. Spoiler alert if you guys didn't know that. All his brothers and all that generation. And then it says this, but the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. Here's what I don't think a lot of people realize. When Israel first came to Egypt, we often think of them being in slavery, right? They were slaves for 400 years in Egypt. But when they first came, they prospered. They lived a good life. Things were really good for them. It says right there, they were fruitful, they increased abundantly, the land was filled with them. This is a blessing that God actually promised to the Jewish people. It's a blessing that he promised to Abraham. You guys know him, right? Father Abraham, he had many sons. Many sons had Father Abraham. So God makes this promise to him that he's going to multiply his descendants. And at this point in history, Israel has grown to 600,000 men over 20 years old. Probably over 2 million total people. They're thriving, they're growing, They're doing really good for themselves. But then this happens. Verse 8. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply and happen in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. They built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses. So now what happens? They're incredibly blessed. But now this new Pharaoh takes over. There's a lot of theories on which Pharaoh it is in history. You can do your own research on it. We don't know for sure. We don't know exactly which one, but there are some very good arguments for different ones. I actually read a really good argument the other day for King Tut. I was like, that's interesting. I never would have thought. It was a really interesting argument. I'm not saying it's him because we don't know 100%. There's arguments of which Pharaoh it was at the time. But this Pharaoh didn't know who Joseph was. So he gets scared and he sees Israel is growing and he says, whoa, this is bad because if our enemies want to fight us, if Israel joins with them, they'll beat us in a fight. They'll beat us in a war. They'll beat us in a battle. So here's what we need to do. We need to enslave them. We need to set slave masters over them and we need to make them work for us. We can't have them rising up against us. So they start to get afflicted. They start to get hurt. They start to go through trials. They start to go through tribulation. But here's what's interesting. Remember I told you God promised Abraham that he would bless his people? Well, God also promised Abraham that this would happen. You see, it's Genesis 15:13. I asked you to turn there. Genesis 15, verse 13. It says this. This is God. Then he said to Abram, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. This shouldn't have caught them by surprise, because God warned the Jewish people. He told Abram, like, listen, eventually you guys are going to be slaves in this foreign land. They're in Egypt, they're thriving, but now they're slaves. And it's crazy. This all starts because of this Pharaoh who doesn't know Joseph. I think this is why it's so important for us to study not just the Bible, but history in general. I wonder if this Pharaoh knew who Joseph was, if this Pharaoh understood that Joseph actually saved the whole nation, that the pharaohs before him respected Joseph, if he understood all these things, if the people of Israel would have ever been enslaved. But he didn't know. He didn't know his own history. He didn't know the history of his own people, of his own country. So he didn't know who this guy Joseph was, so now he's scared of the nation of Israel. But he doesn't have to be. But then, listen to what God says, Genesis 15:14. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge. Afterward, they shall come out with great possessions. You guys can turn back to Exodus 1. So God says, hey, you're going to be slaves for 400 years, but here's what's going to happen. I will deliver you. I will break you free. I will set you free. You will leave that foreign nation and you'll leave it with great possessions. God told them this stuff was going to happen. So what happens next? Verse 12. It says, but the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were in dread of the children of Israel. So the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar, in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service in which they made them serve was with rigor. So what happens? He starts to afflict them more. He starts to punish them more. He starts to give them more work to do, more slave labor, more and more and more. This Pharaoh does not like the Jewish people. So the more they were afflicted, though, it says the more they multiplied. It says the more they were afflicted, the more they grew. It's this interesting riches to rags story. You guys hear the rags to riches story, right? You hear these stories about all these celebrities who grew up and, maybe they were an orphan and they grew up and became millionaires. Or you hear these stories of Steve Jobs who started Apple in a garage. And you hear all these rags to riches stories, but you don't hear a lot of riches to rags stories. But this is what happens to the nation of Israel. This is what happens to these people is they're thriving, they're growing, but now suddenly they're being enslaved. They're being afflicted. And let me say this, guys. No group in the history of the world has suffered as much as the Jews. And I think it's important that I say that and that I talk about that because I feel like this is probably the most overlooked afflicted people group in the world. Literally on the 27th, what's today, the 29th, 2 days ago, how many of you knew 2 days ago on the 27th, it was National Holocaust Remembrance Day? So now look around the room at the hands that are up. Not a lot of you. So think about this. The day in America that we remember the 6 million Jews that were murdered in World War II in the Holocaust, maybe 5% of the room actually knew about that day. Think about that. And this is not new. Like the Holocaust is not this new thing to the nation of Israel. They actually lost their land. They were for hundreds of years. We're not even a nation anymore. Like Israel didn't exist as a country. It was just recently when they became a country again. They were slaves for 400 years in Egypt. Like for some reason, I don't know why, but we don't talk about this. But like Jewish people, like these are God's people. These are truly, truly his people, and they're incredible. And they persevere, and they push on, and they grow, and we see it in this story, this riches to rags story, that they are just afflicted and afflicted and afflicted. But what happens? They multiply, and they grew. In the affliction, they grew into a mighty nation. You see, Pharaoh wanted to weaken them with all the work, but what was happening is all that work was making them stronger. Pharaoh wanted to weaken them with all this manual labor, all this brick and mortar and working in the fields. What was happening is as they're doing all this work, what's happening? They're becoming bigger. They're becoming stronger. Like literally, physically, they're becoming stronger. And my grandpa for years worked with steel. He worked in like a steel factory, and he would always have to do different things where he was like squeezing stuff, cutting steel, doing all these things. And it's crazy. My grandpa is 86 now, and he's still like, he would probably beat me in arm wrestling today. Because all those years of labor, as he did that working with steel, his forearms, his arms, his hands are ridiculously strong. And it's crazy. Like he's been retired forever, it feels like, longer than I've been alive, I think. And yet he is still strong from all of this labor he had to do. And this is what's happening with these people. Think of how big their muscles were. Think about how strong they were from all of this work. God brought them from Canaan to Egypt. And this is important that we understand this too, because if they would have actually stayed in Canaan, one, they probably could have died because of the famine. But two, they would have probably intermarried with the Canaanites, and their nation would have eventually been wiped out. But what happened in Egypt, remember I said the Jewish people are the most persecuted people group of all time? The Egyptians were so racist against the nation of Israel that they would not interbreed with them. They would not intermarry with them. So the nation of Israel is growing just as God promised through this affliction. Physically, in size, in number, in strength, in everything, they continue to grow. Write this down if you're taking notes. Excuse me. I ate 4 slices of pizza before I came up here. The more you're afflicted, the more you grow. The more you're afflicted, the more you grow. The more trials you go through, the more troubles you face, the more things you deal with in your personal life. Guys, I promise you, those things stink. Those things are awful. No one in here is like, man, I'm so excited for my next trial. I'm so excited for more affliction. Man, you know what? I've already had these family members die, but I'm really hoping my house burns down because I love affliction. No one thinks that way. But guys, I promise you, if you are following Jesus, you are sticking close to him, the more you're afflicted, the more you grow. Do you guys know how muscles get bigger? Anyone? Right? So here's how muscle gets bigger. When you work out, did you know you're actually tearing apart? You're breaking down the muscle. So when you're working out, you're not actually making your muscle bigger, you're breaking it. But then when you take like protein and stuff, protein, right? So your farts smell really bad. When you take protein and you're taking these things, you don't always have to take protein, but that helps your muscles build back. And after you've broken them down, when they build back up, they come back bigger and stronger. That's how working out works. You're breaking. So when people like if you want to go and do bench presses, you shouldn't do it every day because you never give your muscles a chance to repair themselves. You just keep breaking them down, breaking them down, breaking them down. You got to give them a chance to repair. So the more affliction you face, the more you grow. I heard this illustration, I loved it. Listen, as trials hit you, as these waves, as these storms come, listen, when you see a wave coming, you can let it knock you down, or you can hop on the board and surf it. You don't have a surfboard, well then you're in trouble. You're in trouble when the trials come, when the waves come. No, think about that though, because guys, in the midst of those trials, I'm sure Israel in the midst of their affliction weren't like, oh, but we're going to go to the promised land soon. God said 400 years. We're going to be out. It's year 360, 40 more years. Right? I'm sure I'm sure it was hard. I'm sure it was difficult. But if you persevere, if you push through, if you look unto Jesus, the author and finisher of your faith in these trials, you'll be able to surf that wave instead of being crushed by it, instead of being destroyed by it, instead of being knocked over by it. Listen, no matter how much the enemy afflicts us, they can't stop God's plan. This is what Pharaoh wanted. Pharaoh wanted to destroy the nation of Israel. He didn't want them to rise up against him. He didn't want them to take over. He wanted to stop them. But what happened when he tried to stop them? They just grew stronger. Verse 15, it says this. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives. Do you guys know what a midwife is? It's a lady who helps deliver babies, okay? So it's like a doctor, but basically for delivering babies. So then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah and the name of the other Puah. It's a fun name. Everyone say Puah, Puah, right? And he said, when you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stools, listen to how sick this is. If it is a son, then you shall kill him. But if it's a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives, the girls in the room are like, yeah. The boys are like, no. Listen, verse 17. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. So what's Pharaoh's plan now? I got it. Israel's growing. They're getting married as they grow up. They're having more babies. They're growing. So here's what we'll do. We'll cut off the source. If we kill all the baby boys as they're born, this next generation won't be able to multiply. This next generation won't be able to keep growing. Eventually they'll die out because there'll be no men for them to breed with. There'll be no men for them to have kids with. This is his plan. They can't keep growing if there's no boys to reproduce. Listen, this shows even back then the lack of value for life was evident. We see it so much in our world today. Did you guys know, talk about January 27th, did you know January 22nd was National Sanctity of Life Day? Yeah. January 22nd is the day that we as a country are supposed to celebrate the value of life, especially for the unborn babies in the world. But you know what? You don't see that all over the media. You don't see that all over the news because we don't value life like God does. But so Pharaoh's plan is if a baby boy is born, midwives, I want you to kill it. And here's the thing, guys. This is Pharaoh, but this is Satan trying to use Pharaoh. Well, what do you mean? Way back in Genesis, when Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit, here's a promise God made. He said the serpent, Satan, would bruise the heel of Jesus. But he said the heel of Jesus would actually crush the serpent's head, would overthrow Satan, would destroy Satan, would get rid of Satan, would get rid of any of Satan's power. Where does Jesus come from? Jesus comes from Israel. He comes from the lineage of Joseph. He comes from these families. So what is Satan's plan? Well, if we get rid of the nation of Israel, Jesus won't be able to come from them. The Savior of the world won't be able to come to them. But what did I say? No matter how much the enemy afflicts us, they can't stop God's plan. And here's what I love. These midwives, these women who deliver the babies of the Hebrew women, says they feared God, not man. They feared God, not the government. Their allegiance was to God, not the governing authorities. Guys, we should never put government in the place of God. We live in a country that's very divided politically. Guarantee in this room, some of your parents are Republicans, some are Democrats, some are probably independent, some are probably libertarians, probably all over the place. Can I guarantee you Jesus is not going to ask about your political party when you go to heaven one day? God's not going to go, you were a Republican. Well, got no room for your kind here. Oh, you were a Democrat. Oh, let me open these pearly gates a little wider for you. You did some pretty good things. That's not how it's going to work. I think too often we think God's a Republican or God's a Democrat. God's none of those things. God doesn't that's not what he is. But he says you should not put the government in my place. These ladies feared God. And that's what matters most. In affliction, in blessing, in every stage of life, we should fear God. And they did not do what he told them to. When I say fear God, guys, when I say that, your attention, when I say fear God, I don't mean God. But I mean we respect him. We have this word reverence for him. We want to be obedient to him. We want to listen. I don't mean we're scared of him, but we have a respect for him. Like we would for some of us, like our parents. We know they love us. We know they want what's best for us. I got good grades in school because I knew I shouldn't bring home a C or a D or even a B sometimes. And I got good grades, honestly, not for myself, but for my parents. Because I feared them in a healthy way, in a respectful way. Not because I wanted to not get punished, but because I didn't want to let them down. We should have this healthy respect for God. So what happens next? Verse 18. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, just lost myself. Why have you done this thing and saved the male children alive? And the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them. So what does he say? He's like, so how come you're not killing these babies? Because these Hebrew women are strong. We're we go to deliver their baby and they've already had it. We can't kill it during childbirth because they're pushing it out before we can get there. Now, we don't know if this is true or not. We don't know if they're lying, if there's a little white lie here. But here's what we do know happens. Verse 20, therefore, it says, God dealt well. God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. And so it was because the midwives feared God that he provided households for them. So now this is interesting. It says God dealt well. Here's what happens, guys. When you're facing persecution, when you're facing trials, when you're facing troubles, when you're facing whatever the world throws at you, maybe the world's asking you to be disobedient to God. Maybe the world's asking you to reject God. But here's what happens. When you fear God and not man, when you listen to what God says and not what the world says, God will deal well with you. Here's the thing about midwives. They didn't have families of their own. Midwives were too busy taking care of other people's kids that they didn't get married. They didn't have kids. But it says this, God dealt with them well. And then what's it say? And he provided households for them. So these ladies who spend their whole lives helping other people to build families, to have kids, to do these things, who will never have families of their own, what does God do? God gives them a family. God gives them one of the greatest gifts he can think of, which is a child. I love what Psalm 127:3 says. It says, "Behold, children are a heritage," or you could say are a gift from the Lord. The fruit of the womb, that's a baby in the womb, right, is a reward. Did you guys know you're gifts to your parents? No, seriously. When you were born, not just that, but when you were conceived, when you were in your mother's womb, and I'm not saying all of your parents have been perfect. I know there's people in this room who might not even know their birth parents, might not know your biological parents. But can I tell you that gift of life that God puts inside of someone, that truly is a gift from him. Whether the person who was given that gift received it correctly, that's on them. And I'm sorry if you're a person who maybe your mom, your dad didn't receive the gift with the joy, with the excitement that they should. But the gift of life, the gift of children, that's a gift from God. I don't know if you guys ever see when people do those pregnancy photo shoots, like when they want to tell people they're going to have a kid and they're all smiling and they're all happy. You guys know what I'm talking about? Like pictures kind of like this one when they're telling everyone that they're about to have a kid. Do we have that picture, David? Like pictures like that? Telling the world that they're going to have a kid? That's me, yeah. And that's my wife right there. And we're going to have a baby in August. Yeah. Yeah. And we're going to name it Pua. No, I'm kidding about that part. Speech, Megan, speech. No speech. Hey, she's doing all the work. You guys can stop clapping. I just get to be here for it, but she's carrying our 3+ months now, 13 weeks, 14. Are we at 14 now? It's almost 14 weeks. August 8th, we're going to have a baby. Little baby. Guys, we're going to name it 7. I'm just kidding. So we're actually going to name it Reginald Fairfield, whether it's a boy or girl. So listen though. So God gives them this incredible gift. And they're happy, they're filled with joy, they're filled with excitement, but the enemy's not happy. So Pharaoh ups his plan. Listen to what he says in verse 22. He says, "So Pharaoh commanded all his people." Listen to that. Commanded all. Let me repeat that. Commanded all his people, saying, "Every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive." Now, we don't know this for sure, but it says Pharaoh told all his people. It sounds like Pharaoh's taking his plan from just killing the Hebrew babies, the Israelite boys, to killing all the baby boys and to throw them into the river. But there's one boy that Pharaoh can't kill. And we're going to learn about him starting next week, but it's this baby Moses. It's this baby who, spoiler alert, is going to grow up in the palace as a prince of Egypt. Is going to go and be a shepherd for 40 years, and then is going to come back and is going to deliver the nation of Israel out of bondage, out of captivity. That through these people who are willing to stand up, who are willing to take persecution, are willing to take affliction, are willing to go through the trials of life and stand up and follow God and do what God calls them to do and not what the world calls them to do, that this baby is going to be born. And that this baby is gonna grow up, and that this baby is gonna deliver these people. Listen, guys, you never know when deliverance will come, but it will come. You never know when deliverance will come, but it will come. You don't know how it'll come. I don't think a lot of people thought some baby would be put into a little ark and a basket and floated down the river. But it will come. I don't think people expected a sea to be parted and a whole nation to pass through it, but that sea was parted. And you don't know by who it might come, but it will come. You never know. I even think of our journey. I've shared a little bit with you guys, but Megan, my wife, her health's not always the best. And we've gone through, literally in our 6+ years of marriage, of just trying to figure out different things. We spent 2 years trying to have a kid. We didn't know when it was going to happen. We didn't know if it was going to happen. We were getting to a place where we're like, okay, as we finish this last process with these doctors, if nothing changes, let's go maybe see some specialists. Let's go try to figure out what's going wrong. Like we didn't know. So really, when this happened, it came as a bit of a surprise to us. Like, yes, we wanted kids, but we didn't really expect it to happen. And I'm not saying us having a baby is deliverance from bondage. Actually, we're going to be losing our freedom, and we're going to be put into bondage as parents right now. I'm just kidding. But what I'm saying, right, that was funny, right? That was funny. But what I'm saying, listen, what I'm saying is you don't know. Like, you literally have no idea what God's plan is going to be, but he's the giver of good gifts. You have no idea when he's going to take you out of whatever situation you're in, but he will deliver you if you fear him, if you seek him. He's the one who's going to do those things. I'm not saying everything you want will come to fruition. I'm not saying he's a genie. I'm not saying you say, I want this enough. Eventually God's going to give it to me. You guys wanted a baby. God gave it to you. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is God will deliver you. He will deliver you from these moments. So as we read through this book, as we study this book, we're going to just look and we're going to see the incredible ways God works through a man who is faithful. But it started because there was these 2 midwives who were faithful. It started because Moses' family was faithful. I feel like Moses gets all the credit, but it was all these people behind the scenes. Guys, you're not always going to be Moses. But some of you are going to be the midwives of the story. Some of you are going to be the mother of Moses in the story, the sister of Moses in the story. You're not always going to be the deliverer, the one who gets to stand and gets all the credit, but we all play a role. And really, in the end, it all just comes down to Jesus. I can stand up here and I can say these things with confidence, and I can say these things with excitement, because I believe that God sent his son Jesus to die on the cross, to come back to life, to give us a way to heaven. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to pray, and we're going to take communion together. And then we're going to just sing some songs of worship. So I'm going to pray. If you want to bring those elements up, Alex, actually, here, let's do this. Let's put one basket on the pool table, one on the air hockey table, and one somewhere by the foosball table. Here's what we're going to do. Worship team, you guys can come up whenever you're ready. I'll pray, and then I'll give instructions for communion. Let's pray. Jesus, I thank you for tonight, and I just thank you that you are a God who delivers us. You are a God who delivers us from bondage, that we can look to the story of Israel, and we can trust that the God who delivered them is still the God that we serve. And as we enter this time of communion, I thank you that you sent your son. I thank you for the sacrifice he made. I thank you that he loves us, that Jesus loves us. And I pray that we would just remember that with every part of who we are. We love you, Lord. We pray this in Jesus' name.